Right now, NATO expansion's gotten stuck, and it's miring countries like Ukraine and Georgia in feuds with Russia that actually prevent them from advancing on the civilian and economic agendas that may or may not ever lead to EU membership, but we'd like to see them advance in those realms of their governance. And right now, they're distracted, and they're partly fending off Russian provocations and aggressions, so they have even less energy and resources to do these things. So whether they wind up in the EU or not, they need to do better than they're doing now with their economies, with their polities, with their overall governance. And I think recognizing that the NATO expansion debate has left them out on a limb, sort of neither fish nor fowl, neither friendly to Russia nor in NATO, is actually causing a net disservice to their advancement. I propose that we negotiate within NATO, with the neutral states of Europe, and then with Russia, a permanent arrangement that would be a form of permanent neutrality for the countries at issue, such that they would not become eligible for NATO membership in the future. But this is not all a gift to Putin or a punishment for these countries. In fact, I hope it's not at all either one of those things. And so what Putin has to also agree, if this goes forward, is that they could be eligible for any other international organization. We're not trying to consign Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, certainly not Sweden and Finland, or Cyprus and Serbia. We're not trying to put them off into some Russian sphere of influence. In fact, Sweden and Finland, two of the countries I write about, are already in the European Union and certainly think of themselves more as Western countries than as Eastern countries. And every country that I'm talking about should have its full sovereign rights. This is not a way for Putin to create some Yalta II, which ended, World War II and divided Europe up into different zones. So the idea is it's a new architecture in which we explicitly agree these countries should not be in NATO, but they should have every other opportunity. And they should even have the opportunity to do some collaboration with NATO on limited security tasks. Let's say peacekeeping, counter-piracy, counter-terrorism training, small to mid-scale stuff. Nothing that's going to be threatening to Russia or look like NATO. But nonetheless, that's why I call it an architecture. But it's not a creation of any new organization. And so in that sense, it's a fairly simple idea as well. I was against NATO expansion in the 1990s, but it wasn't because I thought it was unethical or fundamentally threatening to Russia. It was because I did think that Russians would perceive it as a psychological insult, and therefore it would actually help hardliners like Putin embolden their own bases politically and be successful politically within Russia. In other words, unfortunately, I was sort of right about what happened. But it doesn't mean that I think there was anything unethical or illegitimate about the expansion process. I saw it as a mistake, but a well-intentioned mistake, if you will, and sort of a 60-40 judgment call. So even though the first chapter of my book does pick up on some of the themes that my colleagues Fiona Hill and Cliff Gaddy wrote about in their big study of Putin and try to get inside his mind and understand how he has seen history evolve, I don't want to endorse Putin's view of history. I want to understand it, recognize that it's deeply felt. It's not something he just uses for political purposes at home. He really believes that we are a blundering hyperpower from the Middle East to the various areas of the former Soviet republics where he thinks we caused revolutions at various points in the last 15 years, to the Kosovo War where he thinks we attacked one of his friends unjustly. All this history, he really believes it, but I don't buy his narrative. So I'm in this nuanced argument where I'm trying to say you got to understand your partner or your potential adversary without endorsing his view. And that's a tough message to make because people think you're somehow taking sides, on Putin or Russia's behalf against the West. That's not what I'm trying to do. I don't think my idea could ever succeed if it was seen as partly a reparation for past offenses. And if the Russians ever got the idea that we had that attitude, then they would be, manipulating the hell out of us to try to keep extracting better and better terms. Now, I would hope Vladimir Putin has realized there's no danger of the United States wanting to do him any big favors anytime soon. If anything, the pendulum swung even more in an anti-Russian direction than he might have guessed or than it ever happened under Barack Obama. But nonetheless, I think it's emphatically important that we never view this as an apology. We can understand the history, how it's taken us to where we are, how it's affected Russian sensibilities, how it helped produce Vladimir Putin in some ways. But I don't think we try to walk the history back or feel that somehow what we did was malevolent. It was potentially a mistake, but it wasn't a moral mistake, and it wasn't a fundamental mistake. It may have been a misjudgment at the margins. I'm not trying to argue, as George Kennan did in the late 1990s, that NATO expansion in those early phases was the greatest geostrategic mistake we had made since the Cold War ended. But what I am saying is now we've driven ourselves at this point, at this juncture, into a dead end. And so when I say the worst of all worlds, Ukraine and Georgia have been promised membership. Everyone knows it, including Putin. But we have no timetable for when they would join, no interim security guarantee. And making matters worse, we have also said that no country will join NATO until its border disputes with any neighbors are resolved. So if you're Putin and you hear this, you're like, oh, they want to bring them in, but if I create instability and conflict in certain border areas of those two countries, they won't be eligible. You know, we're almost handing him a formula by which he can keep them out of NATO. That's what I mean when I say it's the worst of all worlds. It's just the worst of all logic in terms of how we've tried to improve the security of Ukraine and Georgia in particular.